Hi, folks. This is Dr. Rob CYWES. I am the CarbAddictionDoc. And, even though I work on the clinical side, I'm a physician treating thousands of patients. There are, from time to time, just incredible stories that resonate with me. And today's video is going to be about a story that just has resonated with me incredibly powerfully. And I think it'll resonate with you very powerfully and give you a lot of motivation, a lot of thoughts. And it really is kind of a historical documentation as well. I have a patient who's been with me for several years now and just done incredibly well against huge adversity. And I'm going to read a story from him. One of the things that we stress in addiction management is when you get rid of carbohydrates, we ask our folks to replace carbohydrates as a source of emotion management with what's called an effort-based emotion management system. And one of the 4 pillars of an effort-based emotion management system are the creative arts. And there's a whole variety of them. But one of the cool ones that if it's something that resonates with you is writing, journaling and writing. And this particular fellow is a guy that has just transformed his life. And I just loved his story. And it was so compelling to me that I said, man, as part of that creative arts, why don't you write this down? He'd done some writing in the past. So he said, okay, reluctantly, I'll give it a go. And he came into my office one day and put this on my table and said, here, doc. And he's given me permission to read the story. And just another little quirk about this particular person. I grew up in South Africa. I grew up with a sport called cricket. It's like if you take baseball and you add skill, you've got cricket. Okay, come at me for that one. If you take baseball and you add skill, you've got cricket. But just like in baseball, you've got a knuckleball, which seems like such a simple, silly ball, and yet it's so difficult to toss, and yet it's so incredibly effective. For those of you that knew the Toronto Blue Jays, there was a guy called David Cohn that just threw a wicked knuckleball and helped to win the World Series for Toronto when I lived up there. But in cricket, we've got the same kind of ball called a googly. And a googly, it's kind of this weird name that I always love saying, and yet it's this weird ball that seems so crazy. It looks like, come on, anybody can hit this thing. And if you can throw a good googly, if you can bowl a good googly, you will get out after out after out. It is just an incredible ball. And I refer to this story because of the man behind it as googly. And the subtitle of this talk is something that he also shared with me. He said, the natural enemy of a type 1 diabetic is their endocrinologist. Think about that as a title. The people charged with treating type 1 diabetes is their natural enemy. It's the fox hounding the hens. Okay, so here goes the story. It was August 1970. I'd had my 9th birthday the month before, and there'd been a few signs of trouble. On vacation, the only time the family ate at restaurants, I was forever having my glass of water refilled. And on road trips, we'd have to stop a lot so that I could urinate. I'd been slightly overweight a few years before, but I was beginning to get thinner and yet not eating less. My father, a radiologist, wasn't too pleased with himself that he hadn't put the clues together sooner and guessed that I was probably what was then called a juvenile diabetic. And nowadays, we call that a type 1 diabetic. Neither side of the family had any history of diabetes. In retrospect, it seems like the only correlating factor was a case of mumps that I'd had a few years before, a viral infection, with chickenpox at the same time that may have brought on an autoimmune attack that wiped out the beta cells of my endocrine pancreas. We still don't know exactly why that happens, folks. This is 1970. I spent about 2 weeks in the children's hospital where my father's group of radiologists was based. Hospitalization seemed superfluous to me and didn't include much that couldn't have been done at home. The food was bad. I developed a hatred for something called zero, salad dressing, and a fondness for sugar-free Jell-O, and my first diet drink, Fresca. Soft drinks weren't usual at home. My European parents hadn't grown to like them after settling in the US. I learned how to test my urine for glucose. All they had was urinary glucose testing, and also test my urine for ketones to look for diabetic ketoacidosis. I also learned how to inject myself with insulin. This kid is 9 years old. Once school began near the end of August, I went to class as usual. Things were different then for diabetics. Glucose testing meant testing one's urine either with a length of colored paper torn from a ribbon impregnated with an enzyme that breaks down glucose and makes the dye go dark, fairly cheap but considered inaccurate, or with a Clini test, a combination of failing solution and chemicals that provided an exothermic reaction to heat. In a handy tablet, one added to 5 drops of urine in a small test tube. No glucose was blue, more glucose, more intense colors, going up to a bright yellow-orange. If you are diabetic right now, if you ever test your blood sugar with a simple skin prick, think about how cumbersome this testing was that these young kids had to do on a regular basis. Urine, of course, lags behind blood glucose in showing an elevated level of sugar. Early on, I came to dread the bad news of high glucose. The dawn effect in the morning with a rise in blood sugar almost always seemed to cause the maximum reading. This would later make me less likely to test my blood glucose more often. And that's also a problem. How often you test your blood sugar. Australians had invented disposable syringes a decade or more earlier, and they were, of course, usual in the US by then. So only in a few outdated booklets did I learn about, think about this, folks, sterilizing reusable glass syringes at home and sharpening their needles on a whetstone. Think about that. Insulin was a mixture of beef and pork, extracted from slaughterhouse pancreases. So after the animal was dead, they'd harvest the pancreas and get the insulin from those pancreases. I was on 1 dose a day of lente, a cloudy suspension with a somewhat prolonged action that had to be mixed before using. For years, I managed to get my father to inject me before he left for work in the morning. I was 9 years old. I was squeamish. I had over a year of the usual honeymoon period, the type 1 diabetics experience when they begin to use insulin. Urine tests rarely showed glucose at all. It might have helped that my family didn't then eat a diet typically high in carbohydrates, and that the suggested diet for diabetics was not as rich in carbohydrates as they later became once the food pyramid blighted the US and then the rest of the world. This is 1970, folks. This is before the 1977 McGovern Commission. This is before 1981, when David Jenkins, somebody who sat on my Ph.D. committee, created the glycemic index to manage diabetics. So this was the way it was before. We didn't eat a lot of carbohydrates. We had a lot of fat. And we didn't have the food pyramid. After that, however, after the food pyramid, things got a lot worse. Morning urine tests were usually the imprecise maximum that Clin test could show. I didn't use fast-acting regular insulin in those days. It didn't exist. Just the longer-acting lente, always the same dose. Think about how poorly that was managed. After some years, I went to 2 doses a day, but my level of urine sugar didn't determine my dose of insulin. I had no idea if this was usual for type 1 diabetics then. There was no internet, there was no communication. All the information came from endocrinologists who had very, very few tools at their disposal. I'd gotten very sloppy about urine tests in my teens. Teens rebel, they reject, and they often go into DKA because they deny the fact that they have this horrible chronic disease. Home blood glucose testing became widely available in the 1980s, when I was in my early 20s. I think I might have used fairly early meters when I was still in my teens. Only one type of lancing device was available at first. Think about that, sticking a little probe in your finger to test your blood sugar. This was imported from Britain, was rather big and clumsy, and cost about $35 then. I was reluctant to prick my fingers, so for a few months I tried using my earlobes. Definitely less painful, but far less convenient. Eventually, the novelty of a blood glucose testing wore off, and I did it less often. I developed the bad habit of guessing at my blood glucose by the way I felt. notoriously inaccurate, but still tempting even today. Synthetic human insulin produced by genetically altered microorganisms. There had been a little produced by altering pork insulin, but it was expensive and mostly available only in Europe. Synthetic human insulin became widely available a bit later. At some point, I made the switch. Initially, it was only slightly more expensive than the relatively cheap animal insulin. That would change, and the price hikes in insulin analogs would be far, far worse, profiteering by pharmaceutical companies. We've seen a 700% increase in the price of insulin in the last 10 years. The other problem with some of the animal insulins is we developed antibodies against those animals. So diabetics became allergic to beef and allergic to pork in particular. I spent most of my 20s in graduate school, so this is a smart guy. One of those tenured graduate students who takes too long to get degrees. Maybe not so smart. I remained reluctant to test my blood glucose regularly and take fast-acting insulin in response to high glucose. Nor did my endocrinologist urge me to try that. I started to eat a high-carbohydrate diet and increasingly low-fat diet per the urgings of my endocrinologist, based on the now developing USDA guidelines. My family's point of view, before the fear of fat had gripped them as well, was that pasta was mostly for poor people, and so spaghetti was only an occasional thing. That's the way we ate before the 1977 Commission. A friend pointed out that I was eating a lot of starch and that this couldn't be good for a diabetic, but somehow I'd been caught up in the new idea that even for a diabetic, complex carbohydrates are good and fat is really, really bad, despite having had almost all the coursework for a bachelor's degree in biology. So the science conflicted very heavily with the recommendations and the national recommendations and the national sentiment of the public to become lipophobic and carbophilic. By 1985, I had my first signs of diabetic retinopathy. By 1985, I had my first signs of nerve damage to the back of my eyes. I had a few laser treatments to keep the proliferation of capillaries in check. Yes, that's English, folks, capillaries. And would have had more laser procedures over the next 10 years or so. So they're frying the back of the eyes, frying the new blood vessels that are forming in the back of the eyes. By 1990, I had definitely had some numbness in my feet, peripheral neuropathy, and the beginnings of impotence. I did go through periods of exercising regularly, walking or bicycling through my time in graduate school rather than driving, hiking, doing some weight training for a few months at a time. I also had a blood glucose meter, but rarely used one because it wasn't recommended. I visited an endocrinologist once or twice a year, but as I mentioned, I don't recall getting much guidance. Already seeing in graduate school the horrors of the effects of hyperglycemia. It's all a bit of a blur how I handled my diabetes until about 2010 or so. Definitely I started using Lantus when it became available in the US, a long-acting insulin, around 2000. And it was $55 for a vial, or about $89 in 2022 currency. $85 a month. Far less than it is now without insurance. Think about that. Far less. And it's cheap to produce. So insurances, at least pharmaceutical companies, have raped and pillaged our diabetics. That is horrendous, folks. That is on the scale of the opioid drug manufacturers that sold opioids, because they're depriving these poor folks of access to medication. Definitely, I went through periods of doing serious hiking or weight training with or without a trainer. I was on daily shots of Lantus. Remember, at this time, Coca-Cola was telling us to move more. It's not their Coke that is causing the sugar in their Coke that's causing problems, obesity or diabetes. It's the fact that we Americans are fat and lazy and we don't exercise more. So Coke spent billions of dollars on the Move More campaign. And they promoted exercise and backed the exercise. Prior to that, Americans didn't exercise very much, and we still don't need to. But we've got this obsession that exercise cures everything. And exercise is great for emotional support and for looking good, but it really doesn't help with these diseases. But that was the focus. If you exercise, you'll be fine. And that's what people started doing. I was on a daily shot of Lantus with pre-meal shots of a fast-acting insulin analog like Humalog or Novolog, occasionally with extra shots if my blood glucose felt high. Felt high. Again, that trust in unreliable guesswork, though I often confirmed it with an actual blood glucose test. My A1C was generally over 10. Guy living with a hemoglobin A1C above 10. By the way, normal in my practice is below 5.2. And my endocrinologist kept recommending only that I take more insulin and get more exercise. There was some drug in a vial or insulin pen that left me nauseated. I believe it must have been Similan, Pramlintide. I don't even know that drug anymore. And I used it for perhaps a year at great expense and with occasional vomiting. I didn't have gastroparesis then, which is paralysis of the stomach from nerve damage. And perhaps I didn't have delayed gastric emptying. But I had some unusual effects and mostly spent my whole day nauseated because of the medication. A later endocrinologist would try the somewhat similar intentioned Victoza liraglutide on me a few years later, which left me with less nausea, but even less effect on my blood sugar. Using these drugs that don't work on type 1 diabetes. These are endocrinologists that should be experts in this. Around 2010, I started a low-carb diet. It wasn't especially strict, but most days I think I ate well under 100 grams of carbohydrates. Think about that, folks. Low carb in 2010 was less than 100 grams of carbohydrates and typically aimed to eat around 50 or under. Until then, I'd been going to wild efforts to eat low-fat and high-fiber. Because that was the recommendations. Low fat, high fiber. I tried replacing pasta with some steamed kernels of hard wheat, but the fiber merely delayed the spike in blood glucose, didn't avoid that spike. I brought stacks of corn tortillas and crisps and crisped them in the microwave until they were glassy and not quite scorched, and ate them with salsa as a meal, just to avoid fatty corn chips and fatty meat that's so bad for you. No butter, only margarine, a little olive oil, or so-called vegetable oil for frying. A family emergency kept me away from home for a year or so, and on a belated visit to my endocrinologist, I had an in-office A1C test before I saw him. It was 8.2. It's on a low-carb diet, if memory serves me correctly. Relatively high, but much improved over my usual reading of 10% or more. "What have you been doing?" my doctor asked. "You're not going to like it," I said. "You're not going to like it, Dr. Endocrinologist," I said, and admitted that I had been trying to eat under 50 grams of carbohydrates a day. He was appalled and applied a stern lecture about how the human brain needs 100 grams of carbohydrates every day and how such a diet endangered my mental and physical health. Think about that, folks. I kept my mouth shut. The man was a board-certified endocrinologist, and I didn't think he'd appreciate a lecture on gluconeogenesis from a patient who hadn't quite completed his degree in biology. So here's a kid or a person who went through university and understood the physiology of glucose metabolism, and yet his endocrinologist is off in the left field religious paradigm of we have to have sugar, with no science to support that concept. And this is what perseverated, both in obesity and diabetes. I knew that I wouldn't be going back to him. So now he loses his doctor. Not just because he was now a 3-hour drive away from where I lived, but because he provided me no assistance. At some point, I read one of Dr. Richard K. Bernstein's books on controlling diabetes. Richard Bernstein is a god in terms of appropriate endocrinology. I've met Richard a few times, absolutely brilliant man, has type 1 diabetes himself. He's 82 or 83 years old now, and has just created this wonderful paradigm of appropriately managing diabetes. But in doing so, he had to tell every one of his endocrinologist colleagues, you guys are wrong. And they ostracized him, they isolated him, they kicked him out, and they did not adopt his methodology. But diabetics do. So at some point, I read one of Richard K. Bernstein's books on controlling diabetes. A few things from it definitely stayed in my head, but much didn't. I definitely seem to have gastroparesis, slow emptying of the stomach, which is based upon the nerve damage to the nerves that control stomach contraction that is caused by diabetes. I tried some of his suggestions about dealing with it to little effect. The number of 140 milligrams per deciliter as a level of blood sugar above which one is definitely doing damage also struck me from Dr. Bernstein. Dr. Bernstein now uses 83 milligrams per deciliter as a normal blood sugar. We use 85, but 83, 85 is normal. Then they said the damage occurred above 140. We now know that damage occurs typically if you're sustainably above 100. But as Dr. Bernstein suggested, trying for a much lower level, I assumed he meant it as an absolute maximum, though I treated it as a sort of threshold at which I definitely needed to take extra insulin above 140. And by the way, folks, most insulin pumps still do that. They still start to increase insulin dosing above 140. That's ludicrous. That's ludicrous. That should be happening above 100. Boggles my mind that in 2022, this, which occurred in the 90s, is still carrying on. Bernstein kept mentioning the use of tiny doses of insulin on a regular basis that seemed very different from the universe I lived in. I knew that I wasn't very sensitive to insulin, but doses of 2 units or less, even fractions of a unit, was surreal to someone who used 5 to 10 units or more as a small dose. I didn't try to follow Bernstein's ideas about diet too closely. I should have. But the world was against those ideas, and still is. For a few years, I went to a sort of boutique physician about an hour's drive south of me, board certified in family practice rather than endocrinology. He suggested a lot of supplements. He offered them for sale, but didn't insist that I buy them, and I didn't. And he had a phlebotomist draw a lot of blood every 3 months, and rather more at the 6-month appointments. Later, I found he was charging me quite reasonably for the lab work. Quest Laboratories was giving him an excellent price for being such a good customer, so he was racketeering and making money by charging me normal prices and then getting a kickback from Quest. He didn't harass me about my low carbohydrate diet, but didn't suggest anything that really helped me either. My A1C tests were generally 6.5 to 7, which is satisfactory for endocrinologists. They love that. Oh, my A1C is below 7. Normal A1C, folks, in my practice, below 5.2. Massive logarithmic difference. Maybe the supplements helped, but I didn't believe that he also was the doctor who put me on metformin. So you're putting a guy on metformin who's a type 1 diabetic. Okay. Eventually I left him and started seeing an endocrinologist near where I live. The endocrinologist gave me a printed sheet on my initial visit and on some later visits, if only out of habit, about how I need to consume 100 grams of carbohydrates a day. Of course, I ignored that. He didn't harass me about it. He kept me on metformin and tried me on Victoza, which struck me as worse than useless and seemed to make my gastroparesis more severe. Yes, it does that. It's a GLP-1 agonist. I've taken that in an experimental way myself, Ozempic, and it was horrible in terms of the GI upset. You inject it and it lasts for about a week to 10 days, and I was miserable during that time. Be that as it may. It didn't make much difference to my blood sugars, which are normally low. Apart from costing me a lot of money once he ran out of free samples, they get you hooked and then you have to pay for those free samples. That's the way the pharmaceutical industry works. At least he made sure that I started using the 10-day version. Although it was available then in the United States, at that time, was a Freestyle Libre. So I started looking at a sort of continuous glucose monitor. I've since switched, per Dr. CYWES' recommendation, to the Dexcom 6. I kept to a low carbohydrate diet, usually under 50 grams, and found that I could get by with 1 or 2 meals a day. So by himself, doing OMAD or 2MAD. My A1C at this time dropped down to 6.2 to 6.7, but I cheated a fair amount seasonally. Too many German goodies at Aldi's in the Christmas season, notably. In the middle of 2020, my endocrinologist announced that he was moving and would join another practice. He'd shift me he'd shift me to another endocrinology group. But in that practice, I dealt mostly with her certified diabetes educator. Must eat carbohydrates and then treat them with insulin. I'd heard about this guy, Dr. CYWES, thanks to his videos on YouTube, CarbAddictionDoc, and realized that his South Florida office was under 30 miles from me, and I had managed to get an initial appointment with him in early December of 2020. At a final FaceTime appointment, we were solidly in the pandemic by then. The diabetes educator made it clear that it was either Dr. CYWES or them. Their paradigm so aggressively differed from ours that they set an ultimatum to their patient. You either do absolutely what we tell you, that so far hasn't worked so well, or you go to CYWES and we want nothing more from you. That's kind of despicable. This guy's looking for help and solutions, and to toss him out of your practice to not be there for you. These are my colleagues, folks. That really upsets me. That stings. But the diabetes educator made it clear that it was either CYWES or them, and I told her that I would give Dr. CYWES a try and return to them if I was unhappy, and she agreed to that. Early in December, I saw Dr. CYWES for the first time. I didn't find the prospect of a carnivore diet too bad. I wasn't eating much carbohydrate. I was eating one meal a day and occasionally cheating with a second smaller meal of several snacks most days. I'd always been fond of meat as a child. I decided not to drink alcohol at first and to try to stop my habit of drinking cream with my coffee. I was eating low carbohydrate vegetables like sauerkraut fairly often, although I'd given up on potatoes only recently. I wished I hadn't learned how to make excellent hash browns with ghee or coconut oil, which is kind of the whole concept of some of the weird keto stuff out there. Use potatoes, but use ghee. But I wasn't so fond of them that I had much trouble eliminating them or limiting them to rare occasions. Soon after my appointment, I went to my usual Quest blood draw office to provide samples for a lab test. When I saw the results, I was worried about the high triglycerides. My triglycerides were 165, but the A1C was about its usual 6.3. And to my layman's eye, not much else looked bad. This is the beginning of his visits with me. Mostly the near carnivore diet wasn't much trouble at first, and hasn't been of late, despite some relapses to old habits. We all relapse, folks. Every few weeks, I still have pancakes made of eggs and cream cheese with a little guar gum as thickener, and usually blueberries. Yes, berries are baby fruits, and this hasn't been a good habit, a leftover from my earlier way of eating. Occasionally, I have sauerkraut with beef, with or without cheese, and as often as I can stand it, no snacks. No snacking. Occasionally, I have sauerkraut with a small onion as a side to pork or preferably beef sausages. But a typical day has been one meal of beef with or without cheese, and as often as I can stand it, again, no snacks. Dr. CYWES is right to say that a snack is always an emotional event. A snack is always an emotional event. Doing without alcohol meant that I'd often have some sausages or cheese just for the distraction. I tried using black coffee as what the doctor calls a bridge to provide a bit of distraction regularly during the day, but I find that I don't like it enough. Soon I started drinking flavored coffee, black with my usual sweetener, a few drops of 25% sucralose solution. And you know what, folks? That is absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. It's still a bridge. I'd hated flavored coffee for my 20s, since my 20s, but now I tolerate it. I actually like it. More than 2 cups of coffee in the morning is too much for me, and drinking it afternoon is a bad idea if I want to sleep at all. So I took up diet drinks from mixers such as Crystal Light and its imitators. Walmart has quite a few selections in bright colors, not entirely unrealistic flavors. And that's absolutely fine. Don't let the internet demonize that, folks. These do provide excellent bridges, except that I think I drink too much and urinate a lot. Okay. If I don't cut back in the evenings, it means waking up often. I definitely still need artificial sweeteners, sucralose for choice, as a crutch. Absolutely fine. If memory serves, my next appointment with Dr. CYWES was in late January or early February of 2021. I'd gotten a home A1C test kit, and before my visit, I used it. I'd been aggressive, maybe too aggressive, with taking fast-acting insulin, Novolog, or insulin aspart, whenever the almost CGM read too high. I've had to use more glucose tablets or solutions than before to correct my mistakes. That means dropping a little bit low. But that's the experimentation that we do. We play around and we find that place where we don't go low, but we're very tightly controlled. And we slowly narrow that amplitude. So I no longer eat candy except the original sweet tarts, which are glucose and maltodextrin flavored with malic acid, only exclusively to remedy low blood glucose. Dr. CYWES is again right about carbohydrate addiction. Candy isn't safe for me, both because I'm an addict and because most of it has a lot of bad for everyone fructose. Bad for everyone fructose. Sweet tarts both lack fructose and to me, taste pretty miserable, that I'm not going to overdo them. Due to my gastroparesis, I generally have no idea when my stomach would empty into my small intestine, and the absorption of nutrients begins in earnest in the small intestine. So Dr. CYWES kept telling me at the initial appointment to inject the fast-acting insulin analog not before a meal, but only when a rise of blood glucose began, which was pretty much what I'd started doing already, just that I'd taken to using too much. So you figure this out. In my experience, the Freestyle Libre sensor typically reads 20 milligrams per deciliter too low, and I'm aiming for my blood glucose between 80 and 90. Think about that, folks. Aiming for my blood sugar between 80 and 90, meaning that the sensor sends 60 to 70 to the reader on the phone app. So that's the problem with the Libre. I love the Libre. It's cheap, but it's not quite as accurate. I was pleased to see a reading of 4.9%. 4.9% on the A1C meter screen. Even allowing for inaccuracy that was over 1% lower than I'd ever been before. By then, I'd also seen the start of weight loss. I think I was around 250 pounds, 113 kilos or so before changing my diet, and despairing of ever going under 100 kilos, 220 pounds. I've been seeing Dr. CYWES every 6 weeks to 2 months. My weight loss stalled at 205 pounds, about 93 kilos, although it's actually gone slightly lower now. Waist and neck measurements have gone down, but at the navel I'm still around 44 inches, 112 centimeters in circumference. A DEXA scan in late November 2021 showed 30% body fat, and I worried that I still might have more visceral fat than I ought to have. After just under a year in November 2021, my home A1C test read 4.8%, but the lab value was 4.5%. 4.5% A1C, with tightly controlled blood sugars in around 80. After just under a year in November 2021, my hemoglobin A1C blood test done in the laboratory was 4.5%. And lab triglycerides were down to 80, despite me drinking some alcohol again. Dr. CYWES is having me try to lower my dose of Synthroid, a synthetic thyroid hormone. Perhaps my relatively high dose has been suppressing my natural production. So we actually started weaning him off his thyroid suppression. The past few months, I've been trying 3 days a week, usually of a high protein sparing, modified fasting, PSMF. As a sort of experiment suggested by Dr. CYWES. As far as I can make out, or at least the way I've been doing it, this means eating several meals a day that are high protein and low fat, as well as low carbohydrate, keeping protein intake high to prevent muscle loss, but indirectly reducing caloric intake. At first, it seemed to reduce my need for insulin. I find a carnivore or near carnivore diet much easier to adhere to than PSMF. And we've now modified PSMF for him so that he's doing it in daily cycles. Carbohydrate creeps in more readily when I'm cooking PSMF dishes. 96% lean ground beef is nasty, skinless and boneless chicken breasts are insipid, and adding onions and tomatoes as well as spices to try to distract me from the lack of fat is all too tempting. So we've modified that. We've learned from folks like him, and we've modified that. I can't order PSMF food on the McDonald's app the way I can order Egg McMuffins without muffins or plain cheeseburgers without buns. So even if you're eating fast food, this still works. And it's very tempting to have a whey protein shake or two rather than cooking anything. Some days, actual fasting seems more congenial than PSMF. So we've got away from that. We've moved away from that based on feedback from folks like this. Ketogenic or carnivore eating are things I can do indefinitely. This has become a way of life. I'm not by any means an ideal patient. I have a weakness for nuts, and I'm trying better off buying none because they're both not food for a carnivore and invariably become snacks. Keto-friendly ice cream and chocolate bars keep going on sale at stores of the regional grocery store chain Publix. Usually buy one, get one free. Another encouragement in my case to excess. And I cannot have those in my home environment because I overdo them. And though erythritol and stevia and assorted fibers are better for me than sugar, I seem to do better staying closer to my carnivore rather than buying processed foods, even those purporting to be relatively benign. You got to get rid of the sales pitch. I seem to do better without alcohol, but I really like wine. And as well as diet drinks, spiked with rum. Beer is out of the question, though, because I used to brew my own, given my diabetes, but that destroyed my blood sugar. I seem to be able to do a small amount of alcohol in sugar-free drinks entirely fine. Although I've gone through times of relative high physical activity, I don't exercise regularly now, due to 2 amputated toes after infections associated with injuries from exercise from way back. I'm less willing to walk than I used to be with lower blood glucose. The danger of an intractable infection in a toe is probably less nowadays, but I'm still avoiding it. Folks, that's a story. It's a story of imperfection, but it's a story of someone who's really treated their diabetes magnificently well. And in essence, gotten rid of their type 2 diabetes, which caused so much damage. And now they're controlling their blood sugar as tightly as a non-diabetic person does, using a carnivore diet, acknowledging that they're imperfect, but striving to do better. And this is somebody who has had to defy endocrinologists to do as well as he can. And as we look at the blood work, this is blood work from a couple of months ago. HDL 53, beautiful. Triglycerides 80. LDL cholesterol 142. Oh my God, he's going to have a heart attack right away. No, lean mass hyperresponder. And by the way, now well under 200 pounds in weight. Blood glucose 80. And this was done early in the morning. That is the dawn effect, 80, controlled by insulin. Creatinine 0.96, so an improvement in renal function despite diabetes. And diabetes kidney damage is a huge problem in long-standing diabetes. BUN 20. Electrolytes all fine. Hemoglobin A1C 4.5. Ridiculously good. Uric acid 4.6. No problem metabolizing protein there. No gout, no kidney stones. Thyroid hormone levels absolutely normal. Thyroid hormones absolutely normal and confirmed historic Hashimoto's disease. Glucagon 13. Vitamin D level 99. Through the roof. This, folks, is possible. It's possible by changing your lifestyle. It's possible by changing your mindset. As this gentleman says, he's not perfect, but is no longer a victim of the type 2 diabetes that is imposed upon you by your endocrinologist. I find this a remarkable story. And it's a story of the history of diabetes, the history of how well we were actually doing until we humans thought we were better than God and nature from 1977 onwards. We defied the food that we were eating because we made erroneous assumptions about harm, and we've harmed ourselves even further. Be inspired by this story, folks. Be inspired. And if you need to reach out to us to do the same, text us, WhatsApp us, 561-517-0642. This is a 2-year journey so far, based upon a lifetime of over 50 years. Take care until next time.